Okay, so today we're beginning our discussion of family law, which is one of the more personal and socially important areas of law that exists. So, unlike contract law or property law, family law regulates relationships that most people will experience directly at some point of their lives. Most people will either get married or, someone who gets divorced, have children, inherit property, or just become involved in some type of family-related legal dispute. And because of this, family law is often one of the more emotionally charged areas of law. And people don't want to practice it because of that. In any case, people generally, they don't really care too much about having a dispute involving a corporation and a contract. They do care a great deal when the law actually becomes involved in questions concerning their marriage, things they hold dear, such as their children, inheritance, or property that's accumulated during a relationship. One of the themes I want you to think about throughout this lecture is the relationship between individual freedom and government authority. So most Americans believe that marriage is a private decision, and we like to think of marriage as a matter of love, commitment, religion, or personal choice. Yet, every marriage is also a relationship that's heavily regulated by the government. And if you think about it, the government decides who we can marry, they determine what procedures must be followed, and they establish rules regarding the divorce process. So, overall, the government is kind of deciding how property will be divided, it's determining things like child support sentences, obligations, and custody arrangements. So, even though marriage feels personal, it's one of the more heavily regulated legal relationships in society. And today we're going to be examining 3 cases that ask a slightly different question about the government's power and family relationships. In Zablocki v. Redhail, we'll ask whether the government can prevent someone from marrying because they owe child support. In Port v. Cowan, we'll ask whether one state must recognize a marriage that occurred in another state. And in the estate of Thornton, we'll examine what happens to property rights when married couples move between different states with different legal systems. So by the end of the lecture, I want you to be able to explain not only what happened in each case, but also why family law has become one of the more rapidly evolving areas of American law. So let's dive into it, and first we got to start off with what exactly is family law. So family law governs legal relationships within families, and this does sound simple, but it encompasses an enormous range of legal issues. So marriage is obviously one of the more important subjects here. The law determines who can marry who, how marriages are created, and how marriages are dissolved. Family law also governs divorce, and this includes questions regarding alimony, property distribution, support obligations, and legal separation. Another major area involves children. Family courts routinely resolve disputes involving child custody, visitation rights, child support, guardianships, and adoption. Inheritance is also deeply connected to family law. When someone dies, questions often arise regarding who inherits property and how surviving spouses are protected. And one thing students commonly overlook is that family law serves several different purposes simultaneously. First, it attempts to promote stability within families. Second, it attempts to protect vulnerable individuals, particularly children. Third, it attempts to resolve disputes in a way that society considers to be fair. And fourth, it creates predictable legal rules so that people can understand their rights and obligations. Historically, family law was heavily influenced by religious traditions and social customs. And over time, however, courts have increasingly begun to just treat family relationships as matters involving constitutional rights as well. And this shift becomes extremely important when we start talking about marriage as a fundamental constitutional right. Now, one common question that students often ask is why the government is involved in marriage at all. So, if marriage is a personal relationship, then why would the state care? So marriage, the reason for this is because it affects things like your inheritance, taxes, property ownership, child custody, healthcare decisions, and financial obligations that you owe to your partner. So the government therefore does have a legitimate interest in establishing rules regarding who may marry and what the legal rights are that are arising from marriage. So the challenge here, however, is just determining where the regulation ends and unconstitutional interference starts to begin. So this question we'll be answering later on when we discuss the case of Zablocki. Now, although marriage is a fundamental right, the state still does regulate marriage. So, for example, the states can establish minimum age requirements for marriage. They can also require individuals to possess legal capacity, meaning that they have to understand the nature of the marriage relationship. And marriage generally requires a consent as well as a valid license. States will also prohibit certain marriages involving close family members. But just notice something important here. Nobody seriously really questions these requirements. So the issue in family law is not whether the states can regulate marriage. It's, because obviously they can. The question is just how far these regulations can go before they become unconstitutional. So marriage receives special constitutional protection because the Supreme Court has repeatedly concluded that it is one of the more important personal decisions that an individual can make in their lives. So in Loving v. Virginia, the court struck down bans on interracial marriage. In Turner v. Safley, the court protected the marriage rights of prison inmates. In Zablocki, the court protected marriage rights against excessive government interference. In Obergefell, the court extended marriage rights to same-sex couples. And together, all of these cases establish that marriage is not simply just a government benefit. It's a fundamental liberty interest that's protected by the 14th Amendment. So one of the biggest misconceptions that people have is that marriage is simply a personal relationship. And like I said, legally speaking, marriage is a status, and the distinction matters because a dating relationship can involve love and commitment, but it generally doesn't create significant legal rights for a person. And that's the importance of marriage. Marriage actually involves those specific legal rights, because the moment two individuals become legally married, they gain access to an entire network of legal rights and responsibilities. It affects your taxes. Married couples can often file jointly and receive different advantages through taxes. And of course, marriage also affects your inheritance. In many states, spouses will possess legal rights to inherit property even when no will exists. It'll also affect different medical decisions. If, say, your spouse becomes incapacitated, then the other spouse is often granted authority to make healthcare decisions. These are a plethora of different decisions alongside property ownership, insurance, immigration benefits, and so on, Social Security, and even parental rights. But the reason that this is more important is because denying someone the right to marry does far more than simply prevent a wedding ceremony from happening. It denies access to an entire collection of legal protections and benefits. And so understanding why people care so much about marriage because you have all of these benefits, it also explains why, the courts just conclude that marriage deserves constitutional protection. And now we arrive at one of the more important ideas in modern family law. Marriage is a fundamental right. So if you open up the Constitution and you were to say search for the word marriage, you're not going to find it. Yet the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that marriage receives constitutional protection under the 14th Amendment. So how did the court reach this conclusion? Well, the answer lies in the substantive due process. Throughout the 20th century, the Supreme Court recognized that certain personal decisions are so important to the individual liberty of people that governments should not interfere with them without extremely strong justification. Marriage became one of those protected decisions, and one of the earliest examples was in Loving v. Virginia, where the Supreme Court struck down laws prohibiting interracial marriage. The court recognized that marriage is one of the most basic civil rights of mankind. Later cases also exposed this principle. Turner v. Safley, like I said, Zablocki v. Redhail, and Obergefell v. Hodges. And notice the pattern here. The court is consistently treating marriage not as a mere government-created privilege, but as a fundamental aspect of individual liberty. So this doesn't mean that the governments cannot regulate marriage, because they can. It's just when the regulations become too restrictive, then constitutional problems emerge. And this leads us to our first case of Zablocki v. Redhail. Now, this is one of the Supreme Court's most important family law decisions because it addresses a fundamental question. Can the government prevent someone from getting married because they owe child support? At first glance, Wisconsin's law definitely seems to be a little bit unreasonable, but the state was trying to encourage parents to meet their financial obligation to their children. But the Supreme Court was forced to consider whether that goal justified restricting what it had repeatedly recognized as a fundamental constitutional right, that being the right to marry. And as we move through this case, just pay attention to the tension between the important interests here. On one hand, the state wants to protect children and enforce these child support obligations. And on the other hand, the state also wants to just preserve the constitutionally protected interest in deciding whether and whom to marry. So getting into the facts, Roger Redhail fathered a child while he was still a teenager. A Wisconsin court ordered him to pay child support, but he fell behind on those payments and accumulated a just significant amount of debt. And Wisconsin had a statute that required certain individuals with unpaid child support obligations to obtain court approval before they could receive a marriage license. So in practical terms, this meant that Redhail could not legally marry unless he satisfied the state's requirements. And the state believed that this would encourage parents to support their existing children before entering into a new familial relationship. And Redhail disagreed and argued that the law violated his constitutional right. Now, under Wisconsin's law, individuals in Redhail's position had to demonstrate compliance with their child support obligations before obtaining that permission to marry. So think about what the state is attempting to do here. Rather than directly punishing non-payment through fines or other enforcement mechanisms, Wisconsin just is using marriage itself as a leverage point here. So the Supreme Court just became concerned because this law didn't really regulate marriage. It effectively just prevented some individuals from marrying altogether, and that distinction ultimately became very important in the court's analysis of this case. So the issue here is not whether child support is important. I think everybody agrees that it is. The issue is whether or not Wisconsin can punish individuals who fail to pay their child support, and states have many mechanisms available to enforce those obligations. Instead, it was just whether or not Wisconsin could burden a person's ability to marry because of unpaid child support obligations. Remember, when courts recognize something as a fundamental right, government restrictions receive much closer just judicial scrutiny than other laws. So the Supreme Court, as you can imagine, ultimately struck down Wisconsin's law. The court held that marriage is a fundamental constitutional right and that Wisconsin's statute placed a substantial burden on that right. The court was particularly concerned because the law simply didn't regulate marriage procedures. Instead, it prevented certain individuals from marrying altogether unless they obtained government approval. And as a result, Wisconsin was required to provide especially strong justification for their restriction, and the court concluded that the state had failed to do so. The reasoning behind this, Justice Thurgood Marshall wrote the majority opinion here, and he just acknowledged that the states can impose reasonable regulations on marriage. They can definitely require licenses, a waiting period for marriage, or the age requirements, but Wisconsin's law went much further than just ordinary regulation of marriage. The law directly interfered with the ability to marry by conditioning marriage on the compliance with child support obligations. So the court concluded that although Wisconsin's goal of protecting children was important and admirable, the statute was not sufficiently tailored enough to achieve that goal. So in constitutional law, having a good objective, it's just simply not enough. The governments must also use lawful means to accomplish their objectives. And this case remains important because it reinforces the principle that marriage is fundamental and it's a constitutional right. And it demonstrates that governments can't use marriage as a leverage tool to pressure citizens into complying with unrelated legal obligations. And more broadly, this decision became just an important line of precedent that the Supreme Court cases would expand upon later on for more constitutional protections for marriage. And later decisions like Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015, they relied on precedent like this case and similar reasoning when discussing the importance of marriage in American society today. So now that we've discussed marriage, let's briefly discuss divorce. So divorce legally dissolves a valid marriage. An annulment is different from this because it treats marriage as though it never legally existed in the first place. I did touch upon this in the last lecture, just trying to go over this for the sake of reiterating it for your memory. Now, historically, many states have required fault-based grounds for divorce, such as adultery, abandonment, or cruelty. And today, most states permit no-fault divorce. And the key point here is that marriage cannot simply just be ended by a personal agreement. Because marriage is a legal relationship, then the state's involvement is generally required in order to legally end the marriage. But this does create a problem that we're going to see in the next case here of Port v. Cowan. And this problem is what happens when a couple wants to divorce, but the state refuses to recognize the marriage. So our second case involves Jessica Port and Virginia Cowan, who were legally married in California, where same-sex marriage was recognized. And later, the couple relocated and eventually sought a divorce when they lived in the state of Maryland. But at this time, Maryland did not permit same-sex marriages, so they kind of said that the marriage didn't exist to begin with. And this created a difficult legal question for the courts. Because Maryland didn't recognize same-sex marriage, could it nonetheless grant a divorce to same-sex couples whose marriage was validly performed elsewhere? So the case is forcing the Maryland courts to kind of just confront this consequence of conflicting state marriage laws that you see here. Now, getting into some of the facts here, one of the more interesting aspects of this case is that there was no major dispute between the parties themselves. Both Port and Cowan wanted the same thing. They wanted a divorce. And the problem was not a disagreement between the spouses at all. The problem was whether or not the state would recognize the marriage for the purposes of dissolving it. And the trial court refused to grant the divorce because Maryland could not recognize same-sex marriages at that time. And that effectively left the two of them in just like this legal limbo area. So, of course, this just creates a crazy paradox problem, and because Maryland was essentially stating that marriage did not exist for the purposes of recognition, but at the same time, the couple did remain legally married elsewhere, as a result, the parties could just find themselves unable to terminate a legal relationship that another state recognized as valid. So, cases like this just demonstrate why inconsistent marriage laws created serious practical difficulties, even before the case of Obergefell and Hodges. So, to resolve this issue, the Maryland court relied on the legal principle known as comity. So, comity refers to the willingness of one jurisdiction to recognize legal acts that occurred in another jurisdiction, and this is called the doctrine of comity. So, without comity, individuals could lose important rights every time that they cross state lines, right? So, this doctrine is more so just promoting stability and predictability. Marriage is one of these areas where comity frequently becomes important because people regularly move between states. So, the ultimate holding in this case was that the Maryland Court of Appeals ultimately held that the divorce could proceed. The court recognized the California marriage for the limited purpose of granting a divorce, and importantly, the court didn't rely primarily on constitutional arguments. Instead, it focused on the principles of comity and interstate recognition, and this decision allowed both the parties to dissolve their marriage and avoid remaining trapped in a legal relationship that they both wanted to end. Now, there is a clear connection to Obergefell and Hodges here, as I discussed in the last lecture, so I just wanted to talk about it. Porter v. Cowan helps us understand why Obergefell and Hodges became such a significant Supreme Court decision. Before Obergefell, same-sex couples frequently encountered different legal rules depending on where they lived, and a marriage recognized in one state might not be recognized in another. So the result was uncertainty concerning divorce, inheritance, property rights, and countless other legal issues, and Obergefell largely resolves these conflicts by requiring states to recognize same-sex marriage nationwide. Now, Porter v. Cowan is important because it demonstrates how family law often intersects with conflict of law principles. The case really just shows us that legal disputes are not always about whether or not a marriage exists. Sometimes the issue is whether a particular state will recognize a marriage performed elsewhere. And the decision also highlights the practical challenges that same-sex couples faced before nationwide marriage equality was recognized. Our final topic concerns property rights within marriage. Different states use different systems to determine ownership of property acquired during marriage. Most states follow equitable distribution. Now, under this approach, courts divide property fairly, although not necessarily equally. So you can have a smaller number of states that follow community property rules, which generally will treat property acquired during a marriage as jointly owned by both spouses. And these differences become important when families just move to one state or another. Now, this slide is important because it's just going to give you guys the backdrop necessary to understand the case we're going to be discussing of the estate of Thornton. So, property acquired before marriage, it's often treated as separate property. Community property will just state generally that you need to treat property acquired during your marriage as jointly owned by both the spouses. And most states will instead follow the equitable distribution, where courts attempt to divide the property fairly. And because states use different systems, legal complications can arise when families relocate. And so our case that we're going to be discussing here, the estate of Thornton, addresses exactly these situations that I'm referring to. So the estate of Thornton addresses what happens when married couples relocate between states that use different property systems. Now, at first glance, this might seem more of like a property law case than a family law case, but family law is very deeply connected within property rights of spouses. If you have questions regarding ownership or inheritance and marital assets, because these things frequently do arise during divorce proceedings after a spouse dies, and these are just more of the things that we need to address here. So this is why this case remains just definitely relevant to the discussion of family law. But getting into the case facts, William and Helen Thornton accumulated property while living in Montana, and under Montana law, much of that property belonged primarily to Mr. Thornton. Later, the couple moved to California, which follows the community property principles. And after Mr. Thornton died, Miss Thornton argued the California law transformed the property into community property, giving herself ownership of one half of the estate. So the court therefore had to really just determine whether or not moving to California automatically changed the legal character of the property. So the central question here is pretty straightforward. Does separate property automatically become community property when a married couple relocates to California? And the broader issue here is involving fairness and predictability. Should individuals lose or gain property rights simply because they moved from one state to another? And the court has to recognize that allowing property rights to change hands automatically could create enormous uncertainty for families. So in this case, the California Supreme Court held that moving to California did not automatically convert separate property into community property. The court emphasized the importance of protecting vested property rights. So in other words here, the ownership interests that existed before relocation shouldn't disappear simply because a family crossed state lines. So this decision helped to preserve stability and predictability in property ownership. Now, the estate of Thornton demonstrates that family law extends beyond marriage ceremonies and divorce proceedings, and it also includes questions concerning property ownership, inheritance, and financial rights between spouses. So the case is more so just reminding us that families, of course, you're going to be frequently moving between the states, and the courts have to develop rules that account for these different changes without creating just these unfair outcomes. So this decision in Thornton ultimately protects individuals from having their property rights unexpectedly altered simply by relocating. So as we conclude today's lecture, just notice that all three cases that I addressed today, it's all revolving around a common theme, and that is the relationship between the government's authority and then family relationships. So in Zablocki, the question was whether or not the government could restrict marriage. In Port, the question was whether or not a state had to recognize a marriage performed elsewhere. In the estate of Thornton, the question was whether a state could alter property rights associated with marriage. And although all of the case facts differ, all three of these cases are still asking how much power the government should really possess over some of the more important relationships that we have in our lives. So, this tension overall between individual freedom and legal regulation, it's definitely continuing to shape family law today, and I think it's of paramount importance to address, and it's going to remain a source of debate for many years to come. But with this said, I thank you all for your time, and I conclude today's lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.